Mace Windu was not the first Jedi to miss a warning about Darth Sidious, and he would not be the last. He was standing in the sub-basement of 500 Republica, the most prestigious tower on Coruscant, with Shakti at his side and a squad of ARC troopers behind him. The trail had carried them through the down-level tunnels of the works to the base of the building where the Republic's Supreme Chancellor lived. He could feel it in the Force, the lattice of fault lines that always preceded a shatter point, a critical fracture in events that only Mace's unique ability in the Force allowed him to perceive. He briefly considered asking Palpatine for permission to search the building, then decided against it. The Sith Lord he was looking for had been there for over a decade, and the Jedi Order had never come closer to finding him than this. But Mace was about to lose the search anyway, because it was being erased by the most spectacular separatist attack of the entire war. By the end of the war, the Jedi knew how close they had come and what it had cost. The Jedi Order once had a thriving mystical tradition, with a holocron of prophecy housed in the temple itself. As a young man, Dooku discovered that his own master, Yoda, had been quietly steering him away from the prophecy for years. When Dooku later took Qui-Gon Jinn as his apprentice, he passed down the same lesson. The future was not something a Jedi should chase, and by the time Qui-Gon was training his own apprentice, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the doctrine had hardened completely. Obi-Wan once told Qui-Gon directly that the Jedi did not have such mystics anymore. In a separate conversation, Yoda went even further, warning that visions of the future could lead a Jedi to darkness. A prophecy sits in the Jedi archives that says a chosen one shall come, born of no father, and through him the balance of the Force will be restored. Somewhere in the Outer Rim, a Jedi named Sifo-Dyas had begun having visions. The canon audio drama Dooku Jedi Lost introduces him as one of the strongest precognitives of his generation, a man who saw entire cities wiped out and the Republic engulfed in war. His teacher, Lane Costana, knew what the Council would do if she brought the visions forward, because the Council's first response to a Jedi having anomalous Force experiences was to wonder, politely, whether the Jedi was well. When she was finally forced to bring the case before them, the room reacted exactly as expected, and Yoda's response was gentle and worried, and structurally useless. Years later, the Jedi who would order the clone army was the same one the Council had quietly sidelined. The Sith Master who would shape that order had already been moving among them for decades. The Legends novel Darth Plagueis documents a string of incidents the Order misread, every time, as ordinary galactic violence. Then came the Inchori Uprising, in which 7 Jedi died, including a member of the High Council. The Inchori were a species naturally resistant to Force suggestion, useful as sacrificial pawns in a campaign that destabilized Chancellor Valorum's administration. Plagueis used Sifo-Dyas as the most damaging instrument in the entire conspiracy. Plagueis, posing publicly as the immune banker Higo Damask, personally cultivated a relationship with the Jedi Master whose visions the Council had filed away. Sifo-Dyas saw war coming, and Plagueis listened and encouraged, while Damask Holdings provided the initial funding for the project that became the clone army on Kamino. While the Order buried its mystics, one master refused to play along. Qui-Gon Jinn treated the living Force as an actionable instrument, and by the time of the Naboo crisis, he had already decided he would not bring some of his deeper perceptions to the Council. The canon novel The Living Force, set just months before those events, shows exactly why. The Order was pulling back from the Outer Rim, closing outposts, concentrating attention on Coruscant, and drifting towards the Chancellor's orbit in ways Qui-Gon found systematically corrosive. As the Jedi withdrew from the Outer Rim, criminal syndicates and Sith proxies were already operating in the territories they left behind. Then, on Naboo, Qui-Gon met a Sith, the first one in 1,000 years. Darth Maul was a Zabrak with a double-bladed lightsaber, trained and aggressive in a way no Force user should have been in this era. In the duel that followed, the one Jedi Master alive who treated Force warnings as institutional data was killed. Maul was killed too, cut in half and dropped into a melting pit, and the only physical specimen of a living Sith Lord the Order had obtained in a millennium was now a corpse with no upper half, leaving the Jedi with nothing to examine and no way to trace the Master who had sent him. Yoda's response after the funeral cut straight to the implication, warning the Council that if one Sith had appeared, a Master was still out there somewhere. The Council named the threat aloud, acknowledged that a Sith Master was still operating in the galaxy, and then resume normal operations without launching a manhunt or reallocating a single resource. In the Revenge of the Sith novelization, when Mace was later asked what could be done with Maul as a lead, he dismissed it in a single word, reminding the Council that Maul had been destroyed. As far as Mace was concerned, the matter was settled. In the same week Maul's body was being disposed of, a senator from Naboo was being elected Supreme Chancellor. The Legends novel Cloak of Deception dedicates whole passages to Palpatine's construction, painting him as the kind of senator who appeared above corruption, above deception or duplicity, a confessor for his colleagues, a man whose lack of charisma and preference for solitude read as proof that he had nothing to hide. In private, a Sith Lord. In public, the most trustworthy face in galactic politics. He had spent years reading the Senate's hunger for strong leadership and reflecting it back at them. And by the time he was elected, the Republic had handed him the authority he needed without understanding what it was for. On the day of his election, Mace Windu sat in the audience and saw a shatter point, a fracture point of unimaginable scale, and had no framework for what to do with that perception. Whatever he was sensing, Palpatine's masking held. A few years into Palpatine's first term, Obi-Wan Kenobi landed on a planet the Jedi archives no longer remembered, Kamino. Tall, pale beings told him they had been expecting the Jedi. They had been growing an army for the Republic for nearly a decade, commissioned by a Jedi Master named Sifo-Dyas. Sifo-Dyas had been dead for years, his visions set aside long before the army was ordered, and no Kaminoan had ever met him in person. A person called Tyrannus had routed payment through an opaque banking sequence on Bog 4. In Legends, the money disappeared into what Yoda would later describe in Labyrinth of Evil as a maze of deception. Jocasta Nu could prove the archive tampering and identify it as Dooku's hand. Every thread led back to a dead Jedi, a missing payment, or a name no one in the Order recognized. The Council accepted the army anyway, not because they were corrupt, but because the alternative was annihilation. Among the soldiers shipping out from Kamino was an ARC trooper designated Fives, one of the first generation of clones the Jedi were now leading into a war whose origins they had stopped asking about. Yoda's confession to Obi-Wan reads almost as a quiet admission, suggesting that the Jedi were always meant to find the clones and always destined to fight this war. Once the Jedi were fighting the war, they could not investigate the army without undermining the Force, keeping them alive. The Kaminoans had been Plagueis' private clients for decades. By the time Obi-Wan landed there, the infrastructure was older than the war itself. On a balcony on Geonosis, Count Dooku leaned towards a captured Obi-Wan Kenobi and told him plainly that a Sith Lord named Darth Sidious was in control of the Senate. It was a direct confession, delivered by a former Jedi Master to a current one, in a setting where Obi-Wan had no reason to dismiss it as performance. Dooku was recruiting, and the truth was his leverage. When Obi-Wan reported it, the Council classified it as manipulation. As far as the Council was concerned, the Sith could not have returned without them knowing, and since Maul was already destroyed, there was nothing left to pursue. The Council had looked into it directly, turned their attention towards the Senate at considerable risk, and came back with nothing to show for it. His logic became its own cage. Yoda reasoned that if Sidious truly controlled the Senate, the Republic would have already fallen, and it was exactly the alibi the conspiracy had been built to produce. Yoda had seen with his own eyes what Dooku had become, and had refused to believe it. The same disbelief now covered every word Dooku had ever spoken about the master he served. Geonosis triggered the Clone Wars, and as the war spread, the Force began manifesting warnings the Order had no framework to process. The Mortis arc in the Clone Wars brought Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka to a pocket of the Force itself, inhabited by three beings who embodied the light, the dark, and the balance between them. The son of Mortis showed Anakin his future as Darth Vader in full. The Chosen One saw, in vivid detail, the catastrophe he was about to become. Ahsoka received a parallel vision in which a future version of herself warned her to leave Anakin's side, because he would lead her to the dark side. The father wiped both visions from their memories, and the Masters never learned what Anakin and Ahsoka had seen. Even the Zillo Beast, a non-sentient creature dragged to Coruscant from Malastare, bypassed the entire city to attack Palpatine directly, and the Jedi dismissed it as an animal on a rampage. The army the Jedi were leading into battle every day was carrying the answer the entire time. The Sith conspiracy had a single point of physical vulnerability, and the inhibitor chip arc in the Clone Wars almost broke it open. It began on Ringo Vinda, when Clone Trooper Tub malfunctioned mid-battle and executed Order 66 prematurely, killing Jedi General Tiplar in front of her sister, Tip Lee. The Jedi attributed the incident first to a virus and then to a separatist plot, and Shaak Ti became the lead investigator. Fives investigated independently, cutting his own inhibitor chip out of his own skull. He discovered that the chips were implanted in every clone embryo at developmental stage 3 on Kamino and identified them as instruments of long-dormant mind control. He was then sent to Coruscant to report his findings directly to Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, which meant the one clone in the galaxy who had decoded the conspiracy was now standing in the office of the man who designed it. Palpatine dismantled the threat in stages. Nala Se, the Kaminoan scientist, drugged Fives during transit. Palpatine framed him as an assassin, and Commander Fox of the Coruscant Guard cornered him in a warehouse. Fives died trying to tell Anakin and Rex the truth, his words trailing into incoherence. But before he died, he named the chips implanted in every clone, and the plan to use them against the Jedi. Shaak Ti's role was its own structural failure. She had the chips and the report, and she could have brought the findings directly to the Council instead of routing them through the Chancellor. But she trusted Palpatine's authority over her own inquiry. A second clone medic continued the hunt independently after Fives died. The canon animated series The Bad Batch later revealed what happened to Kix. He had picked up the sequence, and he was abducted, frozen in stasis, and not revived for 50 years. Around the same period, Plo Koon recovered Sifo-Dyas' lightsaber a decade after the Jedi Master's death, and the forensic effort that followed brought Yoda, Obi-Wan, and Anakin to the conclusion that Sifo-Dyas' final mission had been classified by direct order of the Supreme Chancellor. The Jedi accepted the cover story, and the obvious question was never pressed. Why was the Chancellor classifying the death of a Jedi Master? The answer came to Yoda directly, and he still could not use it. It began with the Grand Master communicating with the disembodied voice of Qui-Gon Jinn. On Dagobah, Yoda received a vision of Jedi being slaughtered alongside their own clones, the first prophetic image of Order 66 depicted years before the event itself. The journey took him next to Moraband, the ancient Sith home world, where Sidious and Dooku conducted a ritual specifically targeting him. Yoda saw Sidious's face, heard his voice, watched himself fight an elderly white human male Sith Lord operating from the Coruscant capital, and saw Anakin Skywalker behead Count Dooku. A separate illusion showed a dying Sifo-Dyas claiming to know the Sith Lord's identity, binding the clone army's origin and the Sith Inquiry into a single thread. When Yoda returned to the temple, he reported only that he had learned to retain his identity after death, saying nothing about the face he had seen or the voice he had heard. In the Legends novel Yoda Dark Rendezvous, a Jedi watching her younglings notes that corridors once filled with meditation chants now echo with hand-to-hand combat drills, children of 12 monitoring comm transmissions, and routing battlefield couriers. Yoda admitted as much himself, telling the Council that winning the war and restoring peace had to come first, and only then could they dig into the deeper mystery behind it. Palpatine used that breathing room to tighten his grip on the Senate, pushing through surveillance legislation and sidelining senators who opposed him, while his emergency authority over Coruscant expanded with each new bill. Bail Organa had been watching the same sequence of events and drawing conclusions the Jedi had not. Bail had watched Senator Seti Ashgat disappear after arguing against surveillance, and Finis Valorum die in the suspicious explosion of a starfreighter. Then a security bill granted the Chancellor wide-ranging powers over Coruscant, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. He gathered a delegation of senators and marched to the Chancellor's office to demand answers. They were met at the door by Sate Pestage, the senior aide, and politely turned away. Inside the noise, however, the Jedi were making progress. Captain Dyne of Republic Intelligence presented the Council with the results of a long forensic effort. A hyperwave transceiver pulled from Newt Gunray's mechno-chair after his capture on Cato Nemoidia had yielded the cipher the Confederacy was using to communicate with Sidious. For the first time in the war, the Republic could decrypt Separatist traffic. In the data stream, they recovered an image of Darth Sidious himself, transmitted at a resolution unlike anything intelligence had ever captured. The Jedi were now looking at the face of the enemy they had been hunting since Naboo. Dyne then raised the matter the room had been circling, whether the Supreme Chancellor should be briefed. Mace said no. The information stayed inside the Council. It was a decision without precedent in the history of the Order's relationship with the Republic. The Jedi had served as the Senate's guardians and the Chancellor's enforcers for 1,000 years, and in that one moment, Mace severed that chain of trust. He was not acting on proof. He was acting on the accumulation of everything the Council had seen and failed to act on before: the unexplained army, the uninvestigated chips, and a Sith Lord who had evaded every inquiry the Order had mounted. They had the cipher, now they needed the trail. The lead began with the artisan who built the chair. A Zycharian designer questioned across the Outer Rim, and the transceiver inside it had been built by a Bith engineer named Thal Kassar. Kassar pointed the forensic effort towards a Lathan Twi'lek pilot named Fa'ale Lay, and locating her took Obi-Wan and Anakin through a series of cantinas across Naos 3, following names through underground networks that served the galactic underworld publicly and the Sith privately. Fa'ale Lay confirmed what the hunt had been building towards. The ship she had delivered matched the Sith Star Courier confiscated on Naboo years earlier, traced to a specific tower in the works. Mace Windu, Shaak Ti, and Republic intelligence assaulted the tower. They followed the escape route through the tunnels beneath the works, and the trail ended at the base of 500 Republica. Mace briefed Obi-Wan on the findings. Circumstantial evidence places Sidious inside Palpatine's inner circle, but Obi-Wan cannot interrogate the aides without Palpatine's permission. Mace told Obi-Wan that the Senate had surrendered so much power to Palpatine, it was difficult to say where his authority ended and where his crimes began. As long as Sidious held the chancellorship, the office itself shielded him from scrutiny. The Jedi could investigate up to Palpatine. His permission was required to search his building. His office received the reports that implicated him, and his authority closed every file before it reached the Council. Captain Dyne stayed behind to follow the last lead alone. While Mace and Shaak Ti regrouped at the temple, Dyne and a small detachment of clone troopers continued through the tunnels beneath 500 Republica, tracing the escape route deeper into the infrastructure of the building itself. At the end of that corridor, Dyne found confirmation. The Sith Lord the Jedi had spent the entire war hunting was not hiding in Palpatine's circle. He was Palpatine. Dyne understood, in full, what the Jedi Council had never assembled from the pieces they had been holding for years. He never transmitted the finding. Palpatine reached the corridor before Dyne could make contact with the temple, and every person who had walked that thread died in the same place they found the answer. Dyne and the clones beside him were killed, and the only independent confirmation of Sidious's identity was eliminated with them. By the time Mace learned Dyne was missing, there was nothing left to recover. Then the Battle of Coruscant hit. Grievous attacked the capital, Dooku lured Anakin and Obi-Wan off-world, and the kidnapping of Palpatine buried an inquiry that had reached his front door. Mace had to redirect from the search to the defense of the capital. Shaak Ti was pulled back to Kamino, and Obi-Wan and Anakin were drawn into a starship battle hundreds of kilometers above the city where the lead had terminated. Even as the file burned, Palpatine was finishing the longest operation of his career. Anakin Skywalker had been having visions of Padme dying in childbirth, and he had gone to Yoda for help. Yoda told him to release the attachment, but Anakin heard nothing but more pious babble about letting things pass out of his life, and he walked out with nothing. Palpatine had been tracking Anakin's loneliness for 13 years, feeding it quietly, and when Anakin left Yoda's chamber empty-handed, Palpatine was already waiting with an invitation to the opera. In the box, the Chancellor leaned in close, listening to Anakin's irritation with the Council and reflecting it back gently, then told the boy a story about a Sith Lord named Plagueis who was so wise, so powerful, who could keep the ones he loved from dying. The Council had known about this relationship for 13 years and had never once treated it as a recruitment channel operating under their noses. When Mace first raises concerns, Obi-Wan voices the Order's own rules perfectly, arguing that Anakin's closeness to Palpatine was an asset rather than a danger. The proposed response was a spy mission, turning the boy's access into a surveillance tool. Anakin came to Mace and told him that Palpatine was a Sith Lord, that he had revealed himself, that he had tried to recruit him. Mace had actionable testimony at last, and gathered 3 masters and went. In the Chancellor's office, the fight was brief and terrible. Palpatine killed 3 Jedi Masters in seconds, and then Mace, drawing on Vapad, drove Palpatine back, beat down his guard, and brought him to his knees. In the closing seconds of the duel, Mace's Shatterpoint perception, the gift that had been silent on Palpatine for years, suddenly spoke. It did not point at Palpatine. It pointed at the doorway, at the Jedi who had just arrived. The Chosen One, Anakin Skywalker, standing frozen as he watched the fight, unsure whose side to be on. Mace had perceived this 5 seconds too late to do anything about it. A blue lightsaber took off his sword arm. Sith lightning struck him in the chest, and a young Jedi watched him fall. The Order had lost the war on a delay because the losing had started long before, when an institution that was supposed to be the galaxy's deepest listeners to the Force had decided quietly that visions were embarrassing and prophecy suspect, and that a child's loneliness fell outside its responsibilities. The Sith the Order was trained to recognize would have arrived with a red blade on the edge of the galaxy. The one who actually came arrived in a tailored robe, in the seat at the head of the table, and stayed there long enough to ask the Jedi, with apparent concern, whether they had any leads on this troubling Sith Lord business. 3 masters died on the floor of his office before anyone understood the answer had always been yes. There is one apprentice in particular whose entire arc only makes sense once you understand the strange, possessive attachment Sidious developed towards him. An attachment that breaks every rule of the Sith code and reveals more about Palpatine's psychology than any other relationship in the saga. And if you want to understand exactly how the Sith Order reached the point where one man could hide in plain sight inside the Republic for 13 years, the full lineage of the Sith, from Bane's rule of 2 through Plagueis' manipulation of Sifo-Dyas to Sidious's election, is covered start to finish.